Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche organization for November 20th. The 15-day period that we've just gone through from October 31st to November 14th, apart from various important discussions that happened among various leaders throughout the world, was fundamentally characterized by two conferences. They were the COP26 Glasgow Climate Change Summit, which was attended by tens of thousands of people from various parts of the world over a period of 2 weeks, and the Schiller Institute November 13th and 14th International Conference. All moral resources of humanity have to be called up. Mankind must be the immortal species. And that conference was a 2-day conference at which thousands of people attended. The character of the discussion, however, at the two conferences was very, very different. Here's a pictorial portrayal of the difference. At the Glasgow Summit, what we had was a kind of ghouls gone wild confab in which the world was supposed to be convinced that it was worthwhile to assemble $130 trillion, according to two of the participants, Mccarthy, formerly the governor of the Bank of England, and Mike Bloomberg, Sir Mike Bloomberg, as he's now known, who tried to assert seriously that $130 trillion could be assembled from the private sector for the purpose of combating something that's not even a problem, namely what they refer to as global warming, as opposed to doing anything about the poverty and the famine that goes on today in the world. The other conference of the Schiller Institute had a different kind of dialogue. Our pictorial rendition of that comes from Raphael Sanzio, the painter, who painted this when he was 21 years old. And it is a depiction of the Mother of Christ enthroned and in communion with a set of saints. That's on the left, you have St. Peter with the keys to the kingdom of heaven. You have on the right, St. Paul. And then behind, you have St. Catherine and St. Barbara. And you have the Virgin Mary with the Christ child in her lap. And that's John the Baptist, the little kid to the right in the loincloth. And the relevance of this image is that it portrays not an event, but a form of communication. You'll notice the prominence of books being read or being referenced in this graphic. Above at the top, that's God the Father with two angels. But this was done by the 21-year-old Raphael Sanzio. And the dialogue that we were doing at that conference was intended to especially inspire youth with the idea of a future being denied to exist by Glasgow. So this is a tale not only of two conferences, but of two different universes and universes of thought. And just to say something about how Glasgow happened and what it was all about, and also what the Schiller Institute conference was about, we'd like to play for you Helga Zepp-LaRouche's characterization of those events.
First of all, the flop 26 obviously did not accomplish what the Malthusians wanted, because a lot of developing countries really could see through that behind this Great Reset and Green Deal and all of these policies to protect the climate supposedly is really nothing else than the effort to keep the development of the developing countries down and actually reduce the population. So many important developing countries did not go along. India, Nigeria, Indonesia, and many others, and naturally China and Russia also put up their own perspective, especially China was pushing nuclear energy. And so from the standpoint of the organizers, it was a complete failure. And I would absolutely encourage all our viewers to really take the time to watch our recent Schiller Institute conference, which was very, very important and in total contrast to the mediocre talks you hear from politicians otherwise. We had a strategic discussion which involved top leaders from Russia, China, and other nations. I mean, this is very much important to look at it all by itself. Then we had an extremely interesting panel on the economy, the hyperinflation, the absolute crisis in Afghanistan and Haiti, and what to do about it, most importantly. We had a third panel with a lot of scientists from many countries debunking the fraudulent science of the COP26 and actually calling on the youth of the world to really study the science behind it. And then we had a beautiful cultural panel, which turned out to be not only on the crisis of the education in the West, but we had a principal from the United States who was on an exchange program in China where she toured for 5 weeks schools, and she contrasted the way how the Chinese school system is putting so much effort into the nurturing of every single student, making sure that really no one is left behind. And then we also had some speakers from China. So it was both on the comparison between the education system in the United States and the West, and China on the other side, as well as how China and the United States in particular could collaborate. So my strongest recommendation is take the time and watch these panels. You will gain a lot out of it.
So to discuss today what that new positive future for humanity can be, as in contrast with the Glasgow ghoulish future, and how the world can be moved away from the one and toward the other, we're going to hear from Harley Schlanger. Everybody here, I think, knows him. Those of you who are here for the first time, we'll get to know him. And so we're going to go right to Harley. Okay, take it away.
Thank you, Dennis. And I'm going to be relatively brief so we can have plenty of time for discussion. But I want to elaborate a little bit more on what Helga was saying about these two different conferences. These were two major international events, but they stemmed from two completely contradictory outlooks, both about the nature of the crises confronting mankind and also about the solutions to those crises and where those solutions will come from. The COP26 conference starts from a conception of a universe which is entropic, which is winding down, in which man is a predator, man is using up scarce resources, man is destroying the environment, creating climate change, and so on and so forth. And the only solution is to reject everything that we've learned in the last 400 years about science. And instead of adopting a continuing commitment to increasing the energy flux density in the system, instead reversing that through medieval kinds of energy sources such as solar and wind. The other conception, as Dennis pointed out, is a conception of man as a creative individual operating within a continuously developing universe. And that the fact that it's continuously developing and that man is a part of that continuous development gives us a capability to allow for improvements in the conditions facing all human beings, something which the COP26 conference rejects. Their view is that the way you contribute to the future is eat less, consume less, unless, of course, you're one of the 1% who jet around the world to tell you that you're eating too much and using too much energy. I just saw a report from the Daily Mail that Prince Charles has one of the largest carbon footprints just in lighting his castle at Christmas time. So the hypocrisy is key to the first outlook. But I'm going to take a look at how these competing scientific and philosophical outlooks address the world when it comes to three problems. And I'm just going to, again, do a summary of this to open the discussion. First, the strategic confrontation between East and West, which was very much central to the discussion at the Schiller Institute, but which was pretty much left out of the COP26 conference because they still operate from a conception that the developing sector is still a part of a colonial world, and that the shift to carbon colonialism will keep them in that status. Secondly, on energy policy generally. And then third, on the systemic collapse of the transatlantic economic system, which is becoming increasingly evident to anybody who takes the moment to look at it. These are, of course, all interrelated, and the solutions to them depend on recognizing why these crises are taking place, which was the forte of Lyndon LaRouche for the last 50 years of his life, analyzing what was the cause of the psychological and epistemological cause of the crisis and why it is that mankind can do better. Now, what's clear, though, increasingly is that the expiration date on this system has expired. And let's start with the question of the use of geopolitics by the COP26 crowd, the Davos crowd, the globalists, the City of London and Wall Street, the use of geopolitics to sustain their system. But there's a growing recognition that this isn't going to work. That's part of the reason the US ended up pulling out of the Afghanistan war. Americans don't want to fight these wars anymore. They cost a lot and they do nothing to improve the security. And if you look deeper, you find out that they were actually created for the purpose of dividing the world. But even within leading political layers, there's a growing recognition that this is leading us on a course toward nuclear war. Now, this makes some of them desperate to go even more aggressive in that direction. But we're also seeing some steps to pull back from that. So in the last week, at the same time you had continued anti-Russian drum beating and anti-China lines out there, the drawing of the confrontation between Poland and Belarus, the use of Ukraine in the Black Sea and Taiwan, there were actual steps back from this that represent at least a recognition that continuing in the pace of developments of the last months, we're headed toward wars. First, you had the Biden-Xi Jinping phone call on Monday. Now, this covered a lot of the usual topics, human rights, China insisting that nations should not interfere in other nations' business, a lot of what has been taking place for quite a while in terms of the discussion. But what's important is that it happened. There was a discussion. There was an agreement to continue the discussion. And it included, on behalf of Biden, an acknowledgement that the US will stick with the one China policy. And Xi emphasized to the United States that China does not want a confrontation. And Biden said the same thing back to Xi Jinping, a step in a potentially positive direction. Then you had the discussion between President Putin of Russia and Macron of France, where they spoke about Poland and Belarus. They also spoke about the Black Sea and Ukraine and Libya. But the Poland-Belarus discussion was extremely important because the same day, Angela Merkel, the outgoing chancellor in Germany, and President Lukashenko of Belarus had a discussion. And in both cases, the discussion was crucial because NATO and the European Union have refused to give any opening to discuss this with Lukashenko. They are, at the same time these discussions were occurring, the European Union exacted new sanctions against Belarus. So how do you have discussion to solve a problem when you're sanctioning the people that you're supposed to discuss with and refusing, as in the case of Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission, refusing to talk to them, claiming that they're conspiring to conduct hybrid warfare using refugees against Western Europe? Well, Putin made the most important point. What's the cause of the refugee crisis? It's not something done by himself or Belarus. It's the wars conducted by the transatlantic powers. It's the continuing sanctions against countries after they've been shattered by constant warfare, as in the case of the US refusing to unfreeze the funds that are legitimately owned by the Afghan people and government. By doing that, and by continuing to impose International Monetary Fund sanctions on these countries, you're increasing the numbers of people who are going to flee and migrate. And where are they going to go? They're going to go to Europe and the United States. So the solution is not to pick a geopolitical fight with Lukashenko and Putin. It's to stop the wars, end the sanctions, and begin a process of economic development. Now, for all the talk at the COP26 conference about the great concern about the large sections of the populations which face economic crisis, supposedly from global warming, but actually from geopolitics and neoliberalism, was there any discussion about the fact that 4 million children may perish in the next weeks in Afghanistan for lack of food, medicine, warm clothing, and shelter? Not a word. Where's the great human rights fighters in the European Union who go along with the idea of withholding funds to the people of Afghanistan, who continue the Caesar sanctions against the people of Syria, who continue sanctions against the people of Yemen, who have been victimized by a war conducted by Saudi Arabia, but backed fully by NATO and the United States? So this shows the hypocrisy. And the fact that you had Merkel and Macron and Biden talking to Putin and Lukashenko and Xi is a sign that perhaps there's a recognition that if we don't change the policy, we'll end up in war. Now, unfortunately, there was no recognition of a change from the failure of the COP26 conference. You had an interesting ending to it where the UK cabinet member who was presiding over the conference, Alok Sharma, fighting back tears, said he was deeply sorry for the failure of the conference. Why did it fail? Why did they not know it would fail? If you say to countries that represent more than half of the human race that the solution to so-called climate change is that they give up the idea of development, they give up the idea of improving living standards, they accept the sustainable agriculture and sustainable energy policies, which means that millions will face the consequences that people today are facing in Afghanistan. How do you expect that to be a successful conference? Well, it wasn't. And in fact, we saw countries such as India, Nigeria, China, Indonesia, and others step forward saying, well, yes, in the case of India, by 2070, we'll get to carbon neutral. Well, given that the theme of the COP26 conference is that we have 8 months or 12 months or maybe a few years to stop global warming, the fact that India pledged to do something by 2070 does not offer much comfort to the imbeciles who came up with this apocalyptic scenario. Instead, what did we see developing there? And developing in the world at large? Moves toward nuclear power from France, from Russia, from China, from a number of African countries. Nuclear power, which, on the one hand, they say, well, it's low carbon, but in fact, it's an energy source of high energy flux density. What's necessary to build up manufacturing in those countries? What's needed in the advanced countries? I'm sitting here in Germany, where we're told this next month, during the course of November, utility rates are going to go up 14%. Why? Because of inflation? No, because of the moves to shut down nuclear and coal. So there's a self-defeating policy that we'll get to in a moment on the inflation question. But you can see once again that the outlook presented at the COP26 is anti-human, anti-science, and will increasingly be rejected by a population if they're given an alternative. Remember, it's not enough just to oppose something that's bad. You have to have a policy that will work. And when we get to the inflation question, that's where we see the importance, the special importance of the LaRouche movement. Now, there's still no sign from Western leaders that they understand what to do in addressing the problem of hyperinflation. You have silly comments being made that the hyperinflation is caused by the COVID crisis, which is the line from Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary. Or Donald Trump said the hyperinflation is caused by government spending. Well, if that's the case, he increased government spending when he was president. Is he the cause of inflation, hyperinflation? The silliness cuts through everything, but it comes down to a simple paradox, which is that on the one hand, there is definitely hyperinflation, and I'll get to that in a second. Cost of everything is going up. Now, if you think the solution is a monetary solution, you're left with two choices. Either raise interest rates to slow down the flow of money into the system, which, if that happens, will precipitate a global financial collapse, but especially a collapse of the Western financial system, the corporate cartels that are heavily in debt, the banks that are carrying on trading of financial instruments with no underlying value. That's what a derivative is, trying to profit from that. If you raise the interest rates and cut the flow of money, there'll be collapses, bankruptcies across the board, uncontrolled. On the other hand, if you have a monetary solution by continuing the flow of quantitative easing, you just increase the rate of hyperinflation. Now, when you look at the inflation, Jose, if you put up the graphic I have, here's just a sense of what's happened in the from September 2020 to September 21. And it's gone up more in October, but used cars and trucks up 24.4%. Beef steaks up 22.1%. Vegetarian beef is what they're trying to push, but I'm not sure what the price is of that. Bacon up almost 20%. Across the board, we see prices going up. In terms of gasoline, in November 2020, gas was $2.11 a gallon across the board. In November 2021, it's $3.50 per gallon. It's estimated that your Thanksgiving dinner this week will be 14% more than it was last year. And if you have to drive somewhere to get there, it's going to be an additional cost. So if you're stuck with this monetary system, the monetary approach, which everyone is, the idea of cutting spending, using austerity, which would be part of the raising interest rates, or on the other hand, just keep giving out money, printing more money, there's no solution there. There's a systemic collapse. So you need to do some things that we can talk about in the discussion session, which were devised by or developed by Lyndon LaRouche based on his understanding of this process, that to the extent you leave economy in the monetary realm, what you're doing is giving the central bankers and the private banks that essentially run the central banks, you're giving them control over the life and death of populations. That's what the Great Reset is. This is where the establishment is pretty much united, except for those who say, let the whole thing crash and start over again. And if that happens, we'll lose maybe half the world's population, including large numbers in the advanced sector. So if you stick with a monetary policy, there's no solution. The solution rests in going back to what LaRouche developed as the American system, his 4 laws, which start with regulating banking. And the problem is the neoconservatives will not regulate banking because their whole view is that you have to have total freedom for speculators to make their profits. If you take that away from them, it's dictatorship. Well, actually, that should be the inverse, or that is the inverse of reality. If you give the power to the central bankers, they'll continue to run a policy which will protect the speculative swindlers who since 2008 have not had to answer for their crimes against the American people and the people of Western Europe. That they've been using quantitative easing to make themselves billionaires, while the average person is seeing their nest egg reduced, losing jobs. We have the supply chain crisis. Why is there a supply chain crisis? It has nothing to do with COVID. It has to do with the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector in the advanced sector, done as a policy of the neoliberals and the corporate cartels that they advise. So the solution rests with what was presented at the Schiller Institute conference. And as I said, we can go through some of this in the question and answer session. But those two contrasting worldviews, absolutely diverse approach in terms of what caused the crisis and what is the solution and the nature of man that's involved in this. That's why what Helga said in the opening segment that you saw, if you haven't done so, take the time to watch the conference. It's available at the schillerinstitute.com. It will give you a sense of what we're pulling together to have the dialogue among leading officials from all over the world about how we can break the power of this global dictatorship of central bankers and geopolitical lunatics and get to a world in which there's mutual cooperation and a revival of the principle of the Peace of Westphalia. So that's what I wanted to present in opening, Dennis.
Okay, thanks a lot, Harley. Our next speaker is Caleb Malpin, the founder and director of the Center for Political Innovation. Now, Caleb was supposed to give a presentation at our conference last week, wasn't able to do that. And I think you're going to get, on the basis of his presentation, sort of a taste of what we did at that conference. It wasn't simply a question of the, quote, diversity of viewpoint. The idea is to arrive at a unity of action among various people, various institutions, various different tendencies of various types. And we're happy to have him here. So Caleb, you're up.
Well, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to address this important panel. Last week, I was not able to participate due to my health. I was getting over a bad cold that kind of took away my ability to speak. So the ability to come here today and give this presentation, despite my being unavailable last week, is greatly appreciated. And this is really one of the most important topics we can be discussing. This really gets to the essence of the problem going on here. I come at things from a Marxist perspective, rooted in dialectical and historical materialism. And one thing that I have observed is that what calls itself left in our current world and in the current global political discourse is a complete distortion of what Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, the leaders of the Soviet Union, the various Marxists of the world, whether they be in the Bolivarian countries of Latin America, whether they be in Cuba, all over the world, Vietnam, you have people who believe in Marxism. But yet in the West, in the United States and Western Europe, we have a current that believes pretty much the opposite of Marxism and rather has embraced the theories of Malthusianism. So let me just quickly, because I know our time is limited, make the point of what Marxism actually teaches as opposed to what Malthus taught. Friedrich Engels, Marx's close collaborator, he wrote an essay called The Role of Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man. And he wrote, "The animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends and masters it. This is the final essential distinction between man and other animals. And once again, it is labor that brings about this distinction. And what defined human beings was that unlike other animals, they were constantly changing and reinventing the way they interact with their environment and more effectively forcing the environment to serve them. And that the relationship between human beings and their environment is constantly changing. The majority of human history was hunter-gatherer civilization, where people lived in tribes of 20 to 30 people and hunted and gathered. But we had the first social revolution with the dawn of agriculture. The dawn of agriculture gave birth to the slave and eventually feudal civilizations that defined the world, where you had people, domesticating animals and growing their own food. And it was out of the Enlightenment and out of the emergence of capitalism that we got the overthrow of the feudal system, and we got, moving toward what we can call the modern world. And the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the English Civil War, and other events were the old feudal aristocracies being overturned and replaced by the modern capitalist class, the factory owners, and in the age of capitalism in its monopoly stage or imperialism, by the bankers, and that those who have the wealth dominate, and that we live in a system of production organized for profit of capitalism. And the problem that Marxists have generally laid out with capitalism is that capitalism holds back human creativity and holds back human productivity, that it restricts, it puts artificial restraints on the development of the productive forces. Engels also wrote, in every crisis, society is suffocated beneath the weight of its own productive forces and products, which it cannot use, and stands helpless, face to face, with the absurd contradiction that producers have nothing to consume because consumers are wanting. This is often told with a little fable. They tell the story of a coal miner, and he's in the home with his son, and his son says, "Father, it's so cold. Why can't we heat the stove?" And the father says, "We can't heat the stove because we can't afford any coal." And he says, "Father, why can't we afford any coal?" And he says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine, and I don't have a job, so we can't go and buy any coal." And he says to his father, he said, "Why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" And he says, "Because there is too much coal." That is capitalism. Capitalism is production organized for profit. Nothing gets done under capitalism. The means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. And as a result of that, you get a situation where people are homeless, not because there's not enough housing, but rather because there is too much housing. You get a situation where people are hungry, not because there's not enough food, but rather because there is too much food. This is the irrationality of production organized for profit. And the goal is to overcome this. The Marxist understanding was that with the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously the mastery of the product over the producer. Anarchy in social production is replaced by systemic, definite organization, and the struggle for individual existence disappears. Then, for the first time, man in a certain sense is marked off from the rest of the animal kingdom and emerges from mere animal conditions to an existence of really human ones. The idea was that to overcome the irrationality of a system based on profits, the banks, factories, and industries, and the major centers of economic power should be seized by all of society and organized rationally so that human growth and creativity can expand and we can get to an even higher state of abundance. Now, Lenin developed the Marxist theory of imperialism, and the Marxist theory of imperialism argued that capitalism, in its monopoly stage of imperialism, was holding back human productivity and especially going to the developing world and preventing countries from economically developing, keeping them as captive markets, grinding them into poverty. This is what Lenin referred to as the export of capital, imperialism, capitalism in its highest monopoly stage. And the idea was that revolutionary energy wouldn't come from Western Europe and the developed capitalist countries. It would rather come from countries in the developing world, like Russia, like China, countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that were struggling to break out of the domination of Western corporations and struggling to break free from that so they could fully develop. Now, one important point that Karl Marx made repeatedly in his writings was that the highest stage of communism, the ultimate ideal of a classless, stateless world, was only possible when a huge amount of increase had taken place, in a society in which scarcity had been abolished. In his critique of the Goethe program, Karl Marx wrote, "In the higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs." And Marx was making clear that until you reach a stage of vast material abundance, until human productivity has reached far higher stages, until then, any talk of building a stateless, classless world is simply foolish, and you can't do it. And it's this understanding that was lost during the Cold War. We saw in the final years of Stalin's life in the Soviet Union, they argued that somehow the Soviet Union was reaching the early stages of communism, and that clearly was not the case. They had not even reached the level of productivity of the Western capitalist countries. But most especially in China, during the Gang of Four period, during the time of the Cultural Revolution, there became this feeling that somehow they could achieve communism in poverty. They could reach what they called a higher stage in poverty. And when you attempt to build an egalitarian society on the basis of scarcity, that results in all kinds of big problems. And the market reforms and the triumph of Deng Xiaoping was largely repudiating this kind of thinking and arguing that the only way to build an egalitarian society is raising people out of poverty is eradicating scarcity, which is the basis of inequality, which is the basis of social hierarchies. Vietnam has had market reforms. Cuba has had market reforms. And while these are still socialist societies, with the state planning out the economy, you don't have the anarchy of production. At the same time, they do have a market sector, and the goal of the state is to maximize material abundance in society, not try to create some kind of equality in a state of poverty. Now, at the time that Karl Marx was alive, Malthus' writings and theories were very widely circulated. And in his book, The Theories of Surplus Value, which is considered to be the fourth volume of Marx's Capital, Marx vehemently critiques Malthus and shows that Malthus' idea that overpopulation is the cause of economic problems and overpopulation is the root of the world's problems is a very dangerous idea. Marx wrote, Malthus' book on population was a lampoon directed against the French Revolution and the contemporary ideas of reform in England. It was an apologia for the poverty of the working classes. The theory was plagiarized from Townsend and others. His essays on rent was a piece of polemic writing in support of the landlords against the industrial capital. Its theory was taken from Anderson. His Principles of Political Economy was a polemic work written in the interest of capitalists against the workers and in the interest of the aristocracy, the church, the tax eaters, the toadies, etc., against the capitalists. Its theory was taken from Adam Smith, and where he inserts his own inventions, it is pitiable. And Frederick Engels, writing to Karl Marx about Robert Malthus and his ideas, he wrote that Malthus's idea was the crudest, most barbarous theory that has ever existed, a system of despair which struck down all those beautiful phrases about love thy neighbor and world citizenship. The Marxist understanding is that human beings are constantly striving to advance, to reinvent the way they interact with their environment, to achieve a higher level of material abundance, to eradicate scarcity and lay the basis for a world in which people work only because they feel like working, in which everyone has enough, in which social hierarchies and inequalities can fade away. But nowadays, what we hear from many voices calling themselves left is something different. We hear these claims that humanity has gone too far, that we're destroying the environment. We hear these claims that that pre-capitalist societies and countries around the world that that have not achieved industrial development are somehow more pure, and that's what leftists should strive for. And in the name of left-wing ideas, we have very, very dangerous ideas coming out that essentially argue that human progress is bad, that human beings are a cancer on Mother Earth, that we need to reduce the human population. And this is not Marxism. This is a complete distortion of Marxism. Marxism's central worldview is one of historical progress. And the success of Marxism has been in China. It has been in Vietnam. It has been in other countries that have used systemic control of the means of production to raise people out of poverty, to eradicate scarcity, and to get to a higher level of prosperity. So what these elements, and you can talk about the role, I know your organization has done a lot to document the role of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and other British intelligence operations in trying to distort Marxism and mobilize the left to serve some of the wealthiest interests in our society. But what is being largely pushed, this Malthusian message that we heard at the COP26, this is not Marxism. If you want to hear Marxism, go and read President Xi Jinping and the leaders of China. You want to hear Marxism, go and read the leaders of Vietnam. Go and read what the leaders of Cuba are having to say. And these are forces that believe in human productivity, that believe in a historical advance. And, if we're faced with the issue of global warming, the answer is obviously not to move backward. The answer is to move beyond fossil fuels, to something like fusion energy, something higher, something more effective, something that is more likely to increase productivity. We can't move backward. Human beings never solve problems by moving backward. They solve problems by moving forward. And this pessimistic worldview that is being peddled in the name of Marxism and leftism is very toxic and dangerous. It's leading to depression and hopelessness. But rather, the slogan that we've put forward at the Center for Political Innovation is that we need a government of action that will fight for working families, that will mobilize to rebuild the United States, to make the United States friendly with Russia and China, and to cultivate a culture of creativity, striving for a higher state of civilization, raising people out of poverty, eradicating scarcity, and moving toward the goal of a society of equality and abundance. Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you very much also, Caleb. What we're going to do, I understand you have a limited period of time, so I want to have Harley respond to what you had to say, see if we can have a little bit of dialogue, and then we'll move along once we've got that accomplished. So, Harley?
Well, what's apparent from just this short exchange is that where we have an agreement is the need for progress, the need for justice, for equality, and also the recognition that what passes as the left today is a complete abomination. In fact, if you even go back to the 70s, the 60s and 70s, the so-called progressive left was against war. It was against the FBI, against the CIA, excuse me, against imperial policies. That's changed completely. But what you find is that this outlook that you described, which is the Malthusian outlook, is absolutely coherent with what the bankers are pushing, typified by the comments of Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum and one of the key movers behind the idea of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Schwab basically said that the desire for the improvement in living standards is what's killing the planet. So on these areas, I find very much agreement between what we're discussing. The real question, though, is how do you move the population to recognize that the discussion of left, right, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative is a fraud? And what I think is important is to realize that including the development of the Marxist alternative, is that there was an element of this that was part of an effort to create a diversion from understanding the American system. And I think you know us well enough to know that our view is that the American system of a Hamiltonian credit policy, of an investment in infrastructure as a way of cheapening the cost of all production, education and cultural development to improve the potential creative powers of every individual so they can be more productive, that when that's been applied, when the American system has functioned, it's worked. And the problem is that the American system doesn't exist in a vacuum. We've been in a war since our founding with the empire. That empire still exists. The city of London is at the center of that empire, and it's completely in alliance with Wall Street and, unfortunately, the European Union. And at times, it's been in the division of the world into two empires after World War II of the so-called Cold War was an effort to stop the view of Franklin Roosevelt that the U.S. and the rest of the West could work with Russia, could work with China on common interests. Today, that policy is coming from Xi Jinping, the idea of win-win. And what we have to do is convince the American people that the future rests with mutually beneficial cooperation and collaboration. And I think that's where we do have a common interest. So that's just a few thoughts that came to mind after hearing you.
Okay, Caleb, you have any response?
Sure. Well, I do want to add that I just got back from Nicaragua, and I was in Nicaragua, and I was there for the elections. And the U.S. government has declared these elections to be illegitimate, but I was there as an election observer, and I saw firsthand that the votes are being counted in the places that they are cast, that all parties are able to monitor the voting process. They claimed in U.S. media that a number of candidates were not allowed to participate. But that was simply false. These were not candidates. These were individuals tied to USAID and tied to George Soros and tied to activist NGOs that were trying to destabilize the country. They were arrested for real crimes, like going around the world lobbying for sanctions against their own country. And they were not arrested to keep them from participating in the elections. And the people of Nicaragua, I watched them come out in big numbers to vote for the Sandinistas, the socialist government of Nicaragua. And the reason they voted for them was very apparent. We drove across the country. We were in Chinandega. Some people were in Leon. Some people were in other parts of the country. And the roads were paved. The roads were better in Nicaragua than they are in the United States of America. The streets of New York City are full of potholes and falling apart and constantly under repair. And the streets of Nicaragua are paved and smooth. They have done so much to eradicate poverty. When the Sandinistas came back to power in 2006, the country was only 52% electrified. Now it is 99% electrified. Even some of the most remote regions up in the mountains have been electrified. At this point, they are giving people ownership of the land that they live on. And many people who lived almost as property of landowners and such now have the ownership of the very land that they've lived on. And I actually got to meet the son of the president of Nicaragua, Laureano Ortega, the son of Daniel Ortega, who is the president. And when I spoke with him, one of the things we discussed was how in Nicaragua they have invested in the population. They essentially view the population as an asset. They see drawing people into a productive economy as the source of the economic strength of Nicaragua. And they have been very successful in doing that, eradicating poverty, eradicating illiteracy, increasing level of productivity in the country. It's been very successful. But not surprisingly, the U.S. government has declared it to be a brutal dictatorship, has just imposed new sanctions on Nicaragua. And this is the same thing that was done during the Cold War. There was an effort to stifle the Soviet Union and their socialist development. There was an effort to destabilize and attack China. And then later with Henry Kissinger, we saw an attempt to manipulate China and the Soviet Union against each other to maintain the dominance of Western banks and corporations. And what Wall Street and London fear the most is countries rising up out of poverty, because human history will continue to advance. New inventions will be created. People will rise themselves out of poverty. That's going to happen. And when that happens, that spells the end. You can almost imagine a game, King of the Mountain. You remember the game King of the Mountain, where imagine that one kid gets to the top of the mountain and he announces game over. That's what the Western capitalists and financiers of Wall Street and London have done. They're at the top of the mountain, and now they say game over. Oh, human progress must end. Well, no, human progress must not end. Yes, there need to be changes in the way we interact with our environment. We need to do so in a more sustainable way. Yes, there are certainly issues that need to be addressed, but claiming that human progress must end, claiming that human beings and their drive to advance is itself the problem, is just completely foolish, because the very nature of human beings is to advance. Human beings seek to advance, to reinvent their relationship with the environment. On these issues, though I come at things from a Marxist perspective, I don't see things in terms of the American system. I see things in terms of socialism versus capitalism. I think you are correct in that most of the left is not putting out an optimistic, progressive, or left-wing worldview, and that we need to put forward real policy solutions about cooperation with China and about building infrastructure and advancing productive forces. Real policy solutions, actual concrete solutions, are the way to get beyond the foolish left versus right, Tweedledee versus Tweedledum dialogue that we're seeing in politics right now, which is particularly destructive and problematic.
Okay, so Harley, we're about to move the whole section, so I just wanted to give you a chance if you have anything in final exchange with Caleb to say. His screen may be frozen. We may have lost his connection. I think that's the case. Let me just say, I want to thank you for being on. I want to say a couple things. Since he's not here, I'll just make the following observations. As you said, you do not see things in terms of the American system. That is the way in which we do. But again, the important thing about the conference, and the whole point about the whole set of discussions that have to happen in America today, is if people are afraid to discuss their ideas with the people who are apparently coming from an opposite or different perspective, publicly discuss them, as we're doing here and as we did in the conference, then this is no longer the United States, or no longer a United States that you wish to live in. You referenced the elections in Nicaragua, and certainly we know that there have been many forms of discussions about the issue of the elections generally, globally, and here as well. And I think that the process that people should remember that precedes an election is the education of populations, the ability to discourse on different ideas and to arrive at startling conclusions, and conclusions that very often will overturn the presumed ideas that a society has held or may think that it holds. Matter of fact, what you have is in a period like the one we're in, you have transitions and changes that happen in society. And when those changes happen, new ideas have to be formulated, have to be achieved, and have to be come by. And though the fury of the particular individuated dialogues about that may be off-putting to some people, we welcome it, we embrace it, we insist upon it, because that's the only efficient way that something, even for example, like the American Constitution itself, could have been formulated. And so I want to thank you for being with us, and hope we're going to hear from you again. We'll have more chances to dialogue and discuss. And thank you very much for being with us today. Okay,
Thank
very
you.
good. Great, great. If you stay with this, great. Oh, Diane, I see you're there. Wasn't sure you were there. We have Diane Sayers with us. We have Joel DeJean, who's an engineer from down in Houston, Texas, and we have Anastasia Battle, who is with us and has some things to say as well. So, Diane, let me go to you first. See if you, since you're supposed to be co-hosting, and I guess you've just returned from a good meal. So, go ahead.
Well, I think that what you and Harley have said about these arbitrary divisions and also the fear that we now see in the society, frankly, of anyone debating or discussing a serious idea is extremely detrimental to human progress. And I will say that what I was struck by in the Schiller Institute conference, and it's happened in a number of these conferences, especially when you're dealing with an area like Afghanistan, which is bordered by many nations and nations in the vicinity like Russia, which is not right on the border, but close, has an interest in what happens there. And the nation itself, Afghanistan, has all kinds of factions within it. The question is, how do you get to a higher hypothesis, if you will, or a higher way of looking at the problem to actually solve it? And that is why Helga LaRouche created this committee for the coincidence of opposites, because if mankind cannot figure out how to get to a vantage point where these differences are in some way resolved is not really a good word, but that you say, look, there's certain fundamental universal principles that have to be upheld. Number one, mankind, humanity, human beings themselves are the measure of economic success, are the measure of progress in the universe, not something less than that. And I think that her idea of the flank in Afghanistan saying, well, look, we have a pandemic, you have a terrible drug addiction problem in that country, that if we forget getting a political agreement or insisting they hold elections, start from the standpoint of a healthcare delivery system, and then we will go from there. And I think that's really a very urgent approach. And frankly, at this point, with the collapse of the culture, the economy in the United States and Western Europe, we're going to have to start considering what we consider actually important. Is it the human being? Is it human life? Or is it better to sit around arguing and getting nothing accomplished?
Okay. So, speaking of controversies and conflicts and things like that, I think I'm going to go to Anastasia, who will have a report for us on some lively goings on out in Detroit. So,
Yeah. Well, let me give you that lively report. Well, I'm sure some of you know we've had a series of deployments onto Wayne State, which is smack dab in the middle of Detroit. And the first deployment we had was back in September. And we had a series of posters. The most controversial sign we had was a sign where we took windmills, turned them into the shapes of swastikas, and it says green energy, more efficient than Auschwitz. And we've been pairing that with the new Silk Road posters that we have, with signs that say, "Do Haitian lives matter?" With a picture of what's happening in Haiti with this absolutely disgusting, oh, there we go. Yep, you can see it in this picture here. Which way for Afghanistan? You could see the drugs versus development. And it's been completely explosive. Just all of the deployments we've had there, we've had 20 to 30 students at a time arguing with us, people listening to the debates that we're having. And we're not just going out there saying, "Oh, you're stupid for thinking, green energy is great or whatever, you idiot," but actually walking people through it, right? Like, I'll give you an example of something that happens. You have an environmentalist who comes up who's saying, "I find this offensive. This is very offensive to me. How could you say this?" Probably not as calm as I'm saying this right now. But, just say, "Look, are you more offended by this sign than the fact that people are dying in Africa?" And it gets them to stop and think for a minute. Well, no. Well, what do you mean by that? And just walking people through, you have African nations now who are calling this green policy carbon colonialism. And that completely shocked a number of students just this past week on the campus. And by the way, you can look up various articles they've written about us. The first ones were completely slanderous, and now they're actually coming out and saying what we're actually saying in this last article, which is very important. But we have to be able to take people through not just how bad this policy is, but what we can do instead. So we're laying out what the new Silk Road is, how the United States can join that, how we can get all of these young people, right? I mean, just think about it. Detroit. This is like in Afghanistan, right? This is a depopulation policy, right? You have to stand against this policy and fight for, massive development if we're going to get out of this situation. The Ccc program, I think, is incredibly important right now because so many people, like, you were bringing up, Caleb, they're depressed. They're going through actual depression, thinking that they're just not worthy of life, that they're not worth it. They're going through horrific situations with the drug problems, with their family lives, with the poverty, being confined, during COVID. I mean, people are really losing it. So we have to think about this stuff. How do we rebuild? So we've had a number of students respond to this, where now they're defending us out in the school campus. One student was walking by, "How could you, if you would just say this nicely, then I would listen to you." And this student turns around, whips his head around, and he goes, "Stop sugarcoating this, they're trying to kill you, buddy." And, and was able to get this out. And he's like, "Oh, that just makes me so mad," and proceeded to sign up with us. So that's the kind of response that we're getting right now. And it's not about finding, masses of people that agree, but it's about finding those handfuls of people that can think, that want to fight, that have the courage to say the truth. And it's not just saying, "Oh, I like what you're saying, I agree with what you're saying," but having the courage to fight for what this actually means. So we're serious about creating this anti-Malthusian resistance. We've definitely gotten some serious traction here in Detroit, in Michigan. We intend to spread this around all over the place. We want to keep reaching out to more and more people. And if anybody on this, on this presentation here or in the audience wants to get involved in doing that, please, we would love to have you out there in the streets all over the country and all over the world. So I'll leave it with that.
Okay, very good. I want to go for a minute to Joel DeJean down in Houston. But at the conference, there was a full panel on Sunday morning, which was devoted to the idea there are no limits to growth in the universe. During this week, there were congressional hearings in the House Science and Technology Committee, which reported on some developments in thermonuclear fusion research, United States-based developments in this particular case. But the panel, of course, went way beyond that. But further, what these technologies and advanced technologies really imply is something that we don't have a lot of chance often to talk about here. We'd like to change that. And so, Joel, why don't you both tell us your own reflections about both the panel, but more importantly, also these developments of this week, or anything else you've heard today from whatever perspective it came, okay, on today's program.
Thank you, Dennis. Some of you may be shocked to hear that there was this very delightful hearing in Congress this week, not on the Build Back Better plan, not on censuring a Republican congressman, but like Dennis said, the Science, Space, and Technology Committee of the Congress, a subcommittee thereof, held a meeting on Lyndon LaRouche's fourth law, which is the fusion program. At least they covered part of it. Now, the meeting was chaired by Congressman Bauman of the Bronx, New York. He's a freshman congressman, did a very good job of running the panel. The panel ran for almost 2.5 hours. And it began with an overview from a Dr. Carter from California who went through some of the recent reports from the National Academy of Science on the plasma technologies and the US fusion program. And it proceeded to go directly to two of the most recent breakthroughs that have occurred in the last 3 months. The first one covered was the breakthrough that occurred in August at the National Ignition Facility out in Lawrence, Livermore, California. And Dr. Tammy Ma, M.A., who's worked out there for the last 12 years, went through how the laser inertial confinement fusion program out there, which is the largest, most powerful laser in the world up to now, consists of 192 lasers that focus on a target chamber of 10 meters diameter, which contains a small tablet containing deuterium and tritium inside a hull room or a chamber. And the lasers don't hit the tablet directly. They hit the inside of the hull room and generate X-rays that impinge on the tablet, compress it, heat it to over 100 million degrees, and the inertia of the tablet hold the plasma together long enough so that fusion could occur. Now, what happened in August is that they achieved, with an input power, an input energy of 1.9 megajoules, that's 1.9 million joules, the output energy from the fusion that occurred was 1.3 megajoules, or 70% of break even. And during the time when the plasma was contained by its inertia and when the fusion was occurring between the deuterium and tritium, which are isotopes of hydrogen, that experiment generated over 10 quadrillion watts of power for that few hundredths of a nanosecond. Now, this is a significant breakthrough, and they're proceeding with upgrades to the experiment to actually get to break even, where you get more power out than you put into the experiment. Now, the second major breakthrough that occurred in September was there is a company out in Boston, which is a derivative or offshoot of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology fusion program. It's a private company called Commonwealth Fusion Systems, and they are using magnetic confinement. And their advance is to use a type of high temperature superconducting magnet. Superconducting meaning that there is no resistance in the coiled wires that make up the magnet. Now, when I say high temperature, I'm not talking about room temperature. These magnets are cooled to the temperature of liquid nitrogen, which is 77 degrees Kelvin, which is 77 degrees above absolute zero. In Fahrenheit, it's 320 degrees minus 320 degrees Fahrenheit. And they achieved the breakthrough in that their magnets, which consist of elements of yttrium, barium, copper oxide, were able to create a magnetic field of over 20 teslas. A Tesla is a unit of magnetic field strength. It's not the car that Elon Musk makes. Now, other people who testified, the head of the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, Stephen Cowley, was introduced by Malpin, and this was the funniest part of the hearing, because all of the congressmen, and they were questioned from the Democrats and the Republicans in the committee, all very positive, showing a various amount of knowledge about fusion. But Bauman made the point that Stephen Cowley, who was from Britain, from England, was knighted by the Queen a few years ago. And these congressmen were tripping over themselves to call him Sir Dr. Stephen Cowley. And for some reason, the Republicans couldn't get his name straight. They kept calling him Crowley or instead of Cowley. But the funny part came when, towards the end, Stephen Cowley made a comment after being addressed as Sir Doctor. He said, "You guys won a revolution, so you don't have to call me Sir." And I think that was like a good slap in the face to these congressmen. Now, Cowley has been at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab for about 3 years. Very impressive background. But he's going through how now, for the first time in almost 2 decades, more students are being recruited to the various fusion programs around the country. And another scientist giving testimony was a Dr. Catherine McCarthy, who's based in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Oak Ridge National Lab, and she is the head of the U.S. part of the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, which is being built right now in southern France, which is a consortium of over 35 countries, including Russia, China, European Union, Britain, Switzerland, Korea, Japan. It's the whole world working together to achieve fusion. They're actually building the hardware, installing it. They are planning for first plasma in 2025, and they are targeting to have 10 times more power out than power put in to start the reaction by the early 2030s. And what came out during the questions is that now you have private companies. They were represented by Bob Mumgard from Commonwealth Fusion Systems, are now taking the breakthroughs that have been made over the decades from the various fusion labs across the country and across the world to actually build smaller compact magnetic fusion reactions using various fuels, mostly deuterium, tritium, some using helium-3 and deuterium. And there's one company in Southern California that's using hydrogen and boron-11 to create a special fusion that does not have the high energy neutron that causes a lot of problems in some of these experiments. So it was very refreshing. Now, they didn't officially call it LaRouche's law. They called it the breakthroughs in fusion in the recent period. And all of these congressmen, they all, except some of the Republicans, they all couched the breakthrough of fusion potential by saying there's no CO2. This would solve the global warming problem. And even some of the scientists go along with this fraud. But the fact that a major committee in the Congress held a 2.5 hour hearing on fusion, which is connected to what LaRouche and our movement have been working for over 40, almost 50 years, is a breakthrough. And it gives some optimism to where this country should be headed. Now, Bob Mumgard made the point that of the 13 companies working on these smaller fusion projects, all of them getting some kind of money from Bezos or Bill Gates and other private ventures like that. He said they have raised over the last 2 decades 2.5 or $2.4 billion, these various companies. And I made the point that that is 1,000 times less money than the US spent 20 years in Afghanistan. And all we got to show for the Afghanistan waste of money and lives is increase in opium yields. Now, I'm sure that most people would agree that increasing the yield of fusion would be much more productive than increasing the opium yield. So I'll leave it there and see what kind of questions we have.
All right. All right. Very good. So first, let me do this. Let me, now that I believe Harley's back, he seems to be moving over there. I think he's actually there with us. So let's see if he has anything to respond to what he's heard. We have gotten a few questions and a few comments in. Diane and I will probably share going through these. But Harley, let's go to you first.
All right, I just have to give you advance warning that I have a German internet system, and the technology of Germany is not quite what it's made out to be. So hopefully I'll be able to stay on with you. I think what Joel just reported is, besides being fascinating, is the basis for optimism. You know, LaRouche has been emphasizing throughout his political career that the idea of limits to growth is the biggest fraud. The Malthusian outlook was designed to destroy the United States of America, and the revolution was fought against it. The American founding fathers were anti-Malthusians. Malthus was an operative of the British East India Company. And the idea that Hamilton brought in his various reports to the Congress as Treasury Secretary could be summed up in saying that the government can address the problem of the general welfare by taking measures that will increase the productivity of the whole population. And that's investment in infrastructure, that's investment in manufacturing, and that's development of the educational process of the whole country. Now, what we're seeing in this fusion, we were working with Congressman McCormick back in the early 80s when a fusion bill was passed in the Congress. And there were several other places. I was in Texas at the time. We got the Texas legislature to draft a proposal that there be more money spent on fusion. At the time, they said, well, breakthrough in fusion is 20 years away. And every 10 years, they'd say it's 20 years away. Well, I think the point Joel made at the end, instead of spending money on wars, instead of trying to resolve the so-called carbon dioxide problem by destroying the world economy, let's generate credit through credit institutions that will ensure that we have the resources needed to do the investigation required to get to breakthrough in fusion. And this would be, to me, if I were back in my youth, the idea of unlimited power, unlimited energy was a hopeful dream. Well, it still is. And it's something that we have to make sure it happens. These things don't just happen. These scientists have to have funding, they have to have resources. And most importantly, we need a population that understands these issues. And so, Joel, thanks for your report. I'm sure hardly anybody had access to that report. So that's my basic comment now.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they'd like to say? Go ahead, Joel.
Oh, I did monitor some of the coverage. There was zero coverage in the New York Times, no coverage in the Houston Chronicle, and no coverage in the major TV stations. So they were too busy covering the various trials about race.
And some of us wonder what that is. That's a topic maybe for another time. So I have one question from the chat, which I want to put forward. I don't know who the author is. The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is such a breath of fresh air for the countries usually having to deal with the International Monetary Fund. The question is how to get investment in infrastructure in the United States, which would be environmentally sustainable. Now, I think in the tradition of Lyndon LaRouche, perhaps somebody would want to say, well, the problem is the premise of the question. But I guess I digress. I'm not supposed to editorialize. So does anybody want to comment on this question? Okay, Anastasia.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think the premise of the question, there's an axiom to it that isn't true. The problem is when you think of an economy being sustainable, there's actually no such thing. There's no such thing as a sustainable economy. If you're growing, then you're growing. If you're not, then you're actually collapsing. You think about attrition. You think about, looking at our infrastructure in this country and any other country for that matter. Over time, if you're not developing and growing, then you're actually collapsing. And what people think of as sustainable economics now, they claim it as green, right? They say this is green. But really ask yourself, is that even sustainable? Right? I mean, can you actually supply enough electricity for the world population with solar panels and windmills? No, that's never going to happen. So what are we actually looking at here? We need to actually talk about human creativity. What actually is going to, Mr. LaRouche defined this as energy flux density. How do you actually measure human creativity? And you can take a whole swath of land and say, how much energy can you fit into that land or into amount of space? And you compare, economies of human societies over time. You go from wood to coal to oil, and now we can go to nuclear and possibly even fusion. But the amount of space that energy takes up gets smaller and smaller. So you're not looking at fixed resources or, something like that. You're looking at how do you create new resources. And I think that's where we have to look at right now. I think you would really enjoy the pamphlet that the LaRouche organization put out called, I think it's just the Crush the Green New Deal. And it's got a picture of the royal family on the front. And we have an image and a whole section going through what energy flux density is, what Mr. LaRouche was talking about, and how we can increase that. Because we don't have to limit ourselves to resources or anything like that. We can create new resources.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Diane, you want to go
Well,
with
some
your?
people might,
Go ahead.
yeah, some people might say that countries in the third world, they don't need all this fancy fusion. They don't even need coal. They don't need that gas and those fossil fuels. Well, all they have to do is go to Haiti, and 75% of the fuel used in Haiti is charcoal. Now, Greta Thunberg might think, well, that's biomass, that's sustainable. Well, 90% of the trees on the Haitian side of Hispaniola have been cut down to make that charcoal. And if you ever try to cook inside a small room with charcoal, you get to know the difference between carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. It's the dirtiest form of indoor pollution you could have. Now, one breakthrough that has not been widely reported, except here in Houston, is that just a day before our conference started, Rice University, which is the university where John F. Kennedy gave his speech of why go to the moon, which was made in September of 1962. The current president of Rice University is retiring. He's resigning effective next July. And the day before our conference, Rice University announced that they have picked their new president. And they made a big deal that he is an immigrant, he's black, and you have to know that blacks weren't even admitted into Rice University until the mid 1960s. And he's an engineer. Now, digging a little further, his name is Reginald LaRouche, and he is an immigrant from Port-au-Prince. He grew up in Queens, got his doctorate in civil and structural engineering in Berkeley, was the dean of engineering at Georgia Tech University, came to Rice about 4 years ago as the dean of engineering, is currently the provost, the highest academic post at Rice, and he is now the new president of Rice University. So anyone who says that the United States can't improve, can't make advances, just look at that selection. Now, I intend, as part of my campaign for Congress, to make contact with this new president. Now, it's a very political post, president of a virtual Ivy League college, university. And part of his resume went through how in 2010, after the Haitian earthquake in 2010, he was part of a group of engineers that went to Port-au-Prince to evaluate the damage and see what could be done. Obviously, his mission was not backed up by the President of the United States or the Congress, and that needs to be changed. So I hope to get to know this fella and get him a copy of the Schiller Institute plan to develop Haiti, and see how brave he is to get out in the open on this.
Okay, we have a response, Anastasia, to your response, and it says, "Thanks for addressing my question. I should clarify what I meant by sustainable. I'm referring to how to defang moneyed interests holding us back from moving forward with more advanced energy." So I don't know whether you would like to address that, or Harley may have something, or you want to just think about it for a minute. We have other matters. In addition, I think, Diane, you've got something.
Mhm.
So, Anastasia, anything to say right now, or you want to give it a minute?
How to defang the
Moneyed
I'm sorry,
interests.
could you just say defang the moneyed interests?
How defang the moneyed interests holding us back from moving forward with a more advanced energy. You know,
Well, I
how to
think you
take
can look
over.
at
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think you can look at Mr. LaRouche's 4 laws, what he had laid out, and how he said that we could actually do that. The first step would be reestablishing the Glass-Steagall here in the United States, but we got to do this everywhere. This has got to be global. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, as the questioner here is familiar with Glass-Steagall, but definitely look up Mr. LaRouche's paper on his 4 laws and what Glass-Steagall is. And if we were to separate out the banking system again, which is what Glass-Steagall does, the investment firms from the commercial banking, then you're going to find that it's going to help clean up a lot of this stuff. I mean, drug money laundering, terrorism, we're going to find we've wasted a lot of money on bailouts that was completely unnecessary. And we can start putting these things through bankruptcy reorganization. And that'll establish an actual clean slate for us to work with. We could take what little credit we actually have and start using it towards what we're talking about here, towards mass development, increasing the energy flux density, increasing our technologies, and starting these types of training programs. So I think I would take a look at that. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks for clarifying.
Okay, good. Diane?
Is this for the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have another one if you don't have anything. But
I have this lengthy one, which I think is worth raising. Someone writes in, it is noteworthy that as soon as the question of scientific method comes up, what we might call ordering principles, the most entrenched ideological pathologies explode and make dialogue more difficult. We see this in the so-called debate on vaccinations, which is fundamentally orchestrated by media to drown out the sane voices of people devoted to healthcare. More broadly, the matter comes up in respect to strategic policy making and economics. This is why the body of writings of Lyndon LaRouche must get circulated, because he, more than any modern spokesman since the American Revolution, ordered these matters so that truth could be established as a standard. The problem with both Marxism and conservative anti-Marxism is that science is thrown out the window. Caleb's reference to Engels' book on humans evolving from apes is one of the leading examples of recent history, underlining how all the political movements coming out of Britain saw humans as beasts. Marx never figured this out because of his own early capitulation to the cultish movements that exploded in Germany under the dictatorship known as the Carlsbad Decrees. LaRouche's clarification of Hamilton's discoveries puts the underlying potential of the American system in a completely different light. Can you comment? And I'm not sure who that was directed to, but I would say Joel and Harley.
Yeah, Harley,
I would say that's a very insightful comment. And I think the important thing there is that what Lyndon LaRouche did, which is unique, was to take the entire known history of mankind, and go to the question of who is actually capable of seeking truth. What's involved in seeking truth? Scientific truth, philosophic truth. And he differentiates between the Platonic outlook and the Aristotelian outlook. And what you find with virtually every ideology is that it starts from an Aristotelian standpoint, that the way to understand the universe is by coming up with names and labels and things, and the relationship of those things, including the vastness of space into the molecular arena. And what LaRouche looked at was the Leibnizian conception, which was developed originally by Plato, of a form of dynamics, that you have to find the underlying principles that give you insights into how things work. And so that's where the difference between LaRouche and Marx, or the Austrian school, or the British Malthusian school, starts. You know, and one, the others, I should say, are serving a master which is not interested in the betterment of the human race. And LaRouche starts with a love of mankind, and that love of mankind exemplified by the belief that all human beings possess a capability of improving the human race and perfectibility. And that's something which doesn't exist in a Marxist perspective. It doesn't exist in the neoconservative or neoliberal perspective. And so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, the next question I have which is from New York. Person is asking, why is it the case that a society cannot stay stagnant? Why does it have to either grow or collapse? Is it not possible to reach a point where people can just live with no problems in their life? What about when we reach zero poverty and no more hunger in the world? What does growth look like then? This is from the commune crowd, I think. No, I don't want to say that. Anybody want to take this up? This is an
I'll just say
old.
something very quickly.
Go ahead.
I'll say something quickly, and I'm sure other people would have something. The problem is that stagnation means essentially you're using up resources. The human society advances by making discoveries and turning things that previously weren't resources into resources. If you have this idea that you could somehow just keep muddling through, then essentially that would mean Malthus was right. We are going to end up with a situation where we use up the resources that we need to sustain life. And then under those circumstances, any people on the planet would be too many. So the question of growth versus stagnation or staying in place is a simple one. We have the capacity to define new resources, to uncover the physical processes by which we can unleash energy, build something new. And that's the challenge for mankind.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, I think Harley's right in that you can't really argue their ideology. You have to go to the principle. And we've used the example of Kepler and the ordering of the solar system. But what I would use is the fact that 116 years ago, we had no idea what powered the sun. We had no idea that atoms could divide and split. We knew that there was radiation from things like radium in the form of alpha particles, beta and gamma rays. But we really had no idea what 99% of the universe consisted of, which is plasmas. And we had no idea about fusion power, which powers every single star in the universe is powered by the fusion process. So if you look at what one person, Albert Einstein in 1905, figured out in a very small 3-page paper that energy and mass were equivalent, but not in a 1-to-1 ratio, but using the speed of light as a constant. If you convert a little bit of mass, you multiply it by 90 quadrillion times to get the amount of energy that is equal to. So it was a collaborator of Einstein in 1920, Arthur Eddington, using Einstein's energy mass equivalent, E equals mc squared, figured out that the reason why the sun was there and producing power for the Earth and the solar system for over 4.5 billion years is because it was powered by fusion. So we've only known definitively about the fusion process for the last 100 years. And you look at the breakthroughs that have been made from just ideas of just one person Now, he didn't keep these ideas to himself. He collaborated with Max Planck. He was very active in the various academies, eventually moved to Berlin. But if you look at that breakthrough, we've been living off the breakthrough in discovering the key principle of the universe for the last 116 years.
Okay, very good. Okay, Diane, you have anything else?
There's another question. I also had some thoughts on this because the whole question of stagnant anything is in complete violation of the development of the universe. And Vernadsky made that very, very clear. And it really should be taught. I mean, people just have to reflect on the development of life on the planet, from very simple forms of life, one-celled creatures, to cold-blooded animals dependent on the sun for heat, reptiles, amphibians, and then mammals, and then ultimately a complete non-linear leap, as if from outside somehow, human beings who transform the earth through creativity. And each type of life actually needs more energy per mass, per given mass, than the previous one. So there seems to be a natural process of the unfolding of this universe that we live in, which requires greater and greater amounts of energy per capita, per square, whatever the area is that you're going to use, more energy throughput, and that is natural. So if you then say, well, we're just going to stop at a certain point, then you are really condemning yourself to a complete hyperbolic disintegration.
Okay. Also for you, Anastasia, they've got another response to your response, which is their final response. They say, thanks. I think we're in a lot of agreement, both in action as well as ideologically compatible. So I guess that will remain to be explored. And that's what that person had to say. I think what we probably can begin to do is move toward a kind of a wrap up if there are things that people might have that they want to raise. I also want to point out that there were 4 committees that were formed at the conference, more or less, coming, as Helga LaRouche had said at the beginning, but people may have joined us since then. There's the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, which, of course, is the committee that's been working for over a year on a higher conception, a higher approach, higher solution to mobilizing the world's medical resources and expanding the world's medical resources to respond to the coronavirus pandemic induced crisis. Actually, that the coronavirus pandemic merely revealed something that was there anyway, which has to be looked at and has to be addressed. And that's the creation of a World Health Platform. Then there was the discussion of the strategic situation and a specific proposal that Helga made concerning what she called Operation Ibn Sina, named after the great philosopher and physician Ibn Sina, who lived during the late 10th, early 11th centuries, 980 to 1037, I believe, were the years of his life. And this was related to how to respond to the Afghanistan crisis. That's already been referenced by Joel, but just to say, the conception is that the nations of that area of the world, along with the United States and, of course, Russia and China, which, of course, is immediately there, would band together to create a circumstance in which Afghanistan would not only enter the overall community of nations in the world, it's been in the community of nations for a long time, but would rather be able to do this as a kind of catalytic project that would allow Russia, the United States, China, India in particular, and other nations to collaborate. So the Operation Ibn Sina was that. There is a work in progress around creating a committee around global warming, certainly to bring a full debate about global warming fully into the public arena. And we're looking for various ways to do that. various scientists have signed in and signed up for that. And then there was additionally a discussion about the issue of education and educational methods, which sort of actually, in one sense, runs through the entirety of everything that we've been discussing here, that the method of dialogue, the method of discourse, and the difference in terms of actually being able to discover methods of inquiry that can lead to the truth. We, at the conference, heard an important presentation concerning China and the role of education in China, how that differs in terms of the success of Chinese education recently to that of what you see, for example, in the public school system of the United States. So with respect to those four committees, we certainly want to encourage anybody that's watching, if you're interested in working with us on those committees, you can contact us through the various means that you know and will be flashing on the screen, of course, ways for you to stay in touch with us. So we just wanted to put that in at this point. So I don't have at the moment any other questions, Diane, although I may have missed something. And if you don't have anything, then I think we'll go to a summary remarks.
I do have one thing which I think Joel might want to address, which is useful and in a way helps pull this together. It's on the question of the small modular reactors. And the person says, I think it's not possible to not ask, why are Bill Gates and other characters of that Malthusian outlook investing in these small modular reactors? He said that it's in part to make up for when the solar panels and windmills don't work. But the writer also makes the point that if you install them wherever you need them, like distant mineral resources in Africa, you can get energy for a localized area without connecting them to a grid. So it's no different in function from the financing methodology. So you don't have to upgrade the entire population as a whole or develop the entire nation or society. And I'm wondering if Joel has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, one word, China. And this did come up during that committee hearing, is the congressman kept asking, well, what is China doing? How far along are they on this fusion? Well, if we don't develop small modular reactors, the Chinese are developing them. The Russians have developed them. So they fear being left behind by the only real economic superpower left, which is China. So just like Sputnik inspired the US to kick itself in the ass and actually start investing in science and technology, the fact that China is developing small modular reactors, fusion, high-speed rail, magnetic levitated trains, a lot of these ideas, almost all of them, were developed in the US, some of them in Germany, and we were too stupid to develop them in the last 60 years. We were too busy fighting wars in Vietnam, invading countries like Panama, Haiti, Iraq, instead of developing ideas that came from our own research laboratories and universities. So people like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, or Bezos, some people call him, even Elon Musk, who has a totally incompetent idea of how to get to Mars using chemical rockets. What they fear is being left behind by the technology being developed by China. And the people on Wall Street, they want to cut in the action, just like they invested in Thomas Edison and eventually took over his company. They can't create anything new, but they can steal it. And that's what they're attempting to do.
Okay, so we're going to go to summary remarks at this point. So we're going to start with you, Anastasia.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. This was really fun. From all of the questions that we've had today, I think there would be a huge interest in looking at Mr. LaRouche's textbook, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. And we've had some discussion amongst our group here about doing a class series. And if you're interested in participating in that, please sign up with the LaRouche organization. We'd love to get back in touch with you, get you involved with what we're doing, get you involved with some of our classes and presentations and readings that we're doing. But it's been a really wonderful dialogue, and I really enjoy hearing from everybody. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. And I'll just mention that this is the book. You can't probably see it too well on the screen, but it's the Lyndon LaRouche's collected works. This is put out by the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. I don't know how to get that to really be clear, but well, anyway, you can get the book from us. Just get in touch with us, and it contains the work There Are No Limits to Growth and several others. Harley?
I just, excuse me, I just like to say something to people who are still hung up on the China question, which is a lot of the population, because they're subjected to an ongoing barrage of lies from the media. But think about this when you look at this, hear about debt traps and concentration camps and things of that sort. The Chinese just completed a link of a high-speed rail system from China to Laos. And what this means is that there will be a high-speed train available for people to travel from Laos to China and China to Laos up to 120, 150 miles per hour. We don't have trains like that in the United States. The fact that Laos, which is a very, very poor country, which was one of the victims of the Indochina War in the 60s and early 70s, is now going to have this. And they're going to have it because of their collaboration with China on the Belt and Road Initiative. That's what the Chinese are doing. Now, is it because the Chinese want to go in the way the British went into African countries and stole all their resources? Well, if you talk to the people in Laos, they don't think that's the case. They're delighted to have the access to this kind of transportation. Now, this brings me to the bigger question that Helga Zepp-LaRouche raised in a discussion with me the other day. Why is the West collapsing? And she said, it's the obsession with geopolitics, with the idea that we have to impose a unipolar world and a rules-based order on every country, which means Laos has no right to develop, that the countries that objected to the Glasgow COP26 conference have no right to sovereignty, that all of that is dependent on subordination to the so-called rules-based order of the unipolar powers, namely the United States, to some extent the United Kingdom and NATO. That world is over. It's changing. No matter what people in the United States and the West think, the only way they can sustain that is through devastating wars. And so the question that I'm posing with this China-Laos rail system is, wouldn't it be better for the Americans to be working on these kinds of projects than on new wars? And just think about that the next time you read in the paper about how bad China is. Think about what the United States has done under the Bushes and Obama in the recent period to destroy nations, all in the name of democracy and freedom.
Okay, thank you very much. Joel?
I want to reference something that happened on this date, November 20th, and I don't mean the birth of Joe Biden 79 years ago. Although we did survive Kamala Harris being president for a few hours yesterday when Biden was undergoing a colonoscopy. So thank God for that. Now, 23 years ago today, the first module of the International Space Station was lifted into orbit by a Russian rocket lifting off of the Baikonur Air Base in Kazakhstan. It was joined 2 weeks later by an American module lifted off the Earth by the Space Shuttle. And in the last 21 years, we've had a continuous occupation of the space station and various groupings of astronauts, Russian, European, Japanese. For the last 21 years, we have occupied space. Now, if you want to know the difference between sustainable economies and a human economy, you have to go to space. And just look at the dinosaurs. They had it pretty good for a few 100 million years, and they had sustainable economies. But because they didn't have a space program, they looked up in the sky one day and they didn't see the moon or the sun. They saw a huge asteroid coming down to wipe them out because they were too stupid to have a space program. So now that we've occupied low Earth orbit, it's time to fully fund the Artemis to go back to the moon, eventually with fusion rockets to go to Mars, and to occupy the solar system, eventually the galaxy, and we have about 2 trillion galaxies to work with, so we got plenty of work to do.
All right, very good. Okay, and Diane, I guess that leaves you.
Well, I would say what we're discussing should give people a sense of why the name Lyndon LaRouche is still the hottest name anywhere on the planet. It's far more controversial than Donald Trump or anything else that people, Karl Marx or whatever else people may think they can come up with. And the reason is because Lyndon LaRouche was, as you will see as you dig into his writings and begin to get a sense of the extraordinary volume of his works, is that his dedication was that genius and brilliant insights are not the property of some elite group or someone who was born with a particular kind of genetic something or other, but is reproducible and can be taught. And not only should each generation consume more energy and have a higher standard of living than the previous one, but each generation should actually be better. The next generations of human beings should be superior in their intellect, their morality, their culture, than we are today. And you may say, at least in the Western world, that's a rather low bar, but that is really the commitment that this is intelligible, it's not arbitrary, and that conception is the biggest threat to the oligarchy.
Okay, so Anastasia Battle, Joel Zajan, Harley Schlanger, Diane Sayre. We want to thank you for being with us today. And we also want to thank Caleb Malpin, founder and director of the Center for Political Innovation, for joining our program, being part of the discussion. We're going to conclude today. It was already brought up by Joel, the date November 20th, but today is also the anniversary of something else. 245 years ago, in Fort Lee, New Jersey, the forces of the American Revolution beat a hasty retreat as they were being pursued by British redcoats. It was an ignominious retreat, and a series of battles had happened before that. I think we may have a graphic of this. We'd had the Battle of Harlem Heights. That had been in September of 1776. We had the Battle of Fort Washington, November 14th, the Battle of Fort Lee. They were all defeats, although the case of Harlem Heights was a kind of holding action for a period of time. These were battles that had come in the immediate wake of the Declaration of Independence in July in Philadelphia. And by the time you got to basically a few days later into August, one of the largest military forces in history was seen. And that military force crossed the Hudson. You see Fort Lee and you see where Fort Washington is, and surprised the American forces. And the American forces left in such haste that the pots they were cooking breakfast on were still hot when the British got there in hot pursuit of them. They proceeded to retreat throughout New Jersey during the month of November, and finally into Pennsylvania, where starting out with about 10,000 troops, Washington was down to about 3,000. And at that point, you can let the graphic go now. At that point, he had to make a momentous decision, which he made. He had made the decision a little bit earlier than Christmas night, but Christmas night, 1776, when he came back across the Delaware River from Pennsylvania. What had happened, just to be clear, was that he knew that the river would ice over. What the British were waiting for was for the river to ice over, and they would just come and take Washington, capture him, hang him. That would be the end of the American Revolution. And he made a decision to do something which has become famous in history as the Battle of Trenton, a surprise attack, unexpected, which psychologically turned the tide of the American Revolution. It was followed by the Battle of Princeton, which was a decisive and important victory just a few days later. That was 245 years ago. Today in America, if you ask people about Great Britain, you get a lot of talk about the greatness or the popularity of Queen Elizabeth and the popularity of this and that and the other. And of course, Lyndon LaRouche, for almost a half century, had been identified as being a rather vociferous opponent of British imperialism and the British Empire. But what's important about today to realize is that that retreat was a retreat into victory for the United States on such a sea are we now afloat. In one sense, and we have a country whose people are very, very confused about who they are, about their revolutionary identity, an identity that many of us would argue is way, way superior to anything that either Marxism, or socialism could ever hope to match. But there is a problem, because the problem is that the founders are virtually unknown to many of the American people today. The actual nature of the thought processes of Benjamin Franklin or of Alexander Hamilton or Washington in particular, and others, John Jay, the confused but sometimes revolutionary thought processes of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Monroe, the important and almost unknown figure of Gouverneur Morris. This history and the founding of a revolutionary economic practice by Alexander Hamilton, using the ideas of Benjamin Franklin and written out in a series of documents, I would argue significantly more important to read than the economic writings of, let's say, of Vladimir Lenin. The report on the subject of manufactures, on public credit, on the national bank, the constitutionality of the bank. These documents are not only the foundations for the United States, they're actually the foundations for freedom for people all over the world. They have very little, almost nothing to do with Adam Smith. They have almost nothing to do with what people generally refer to as capitalism. They do advocate capital formation. They certainly advocate advanced science and technology, but they are not ideological. The American system was a system of revolution based on the notion of human creativity and human reason being the highest expression of human identity. And it was so strong as an idea that it was able to supplant the ideas of slavery, which were practiced in the United States, inclusive of in this New York, New Jersey area from which we generally do emanate our webcasts. But what's important to understand is that we're now 5 years away, a little bit less actually, in one sense, from the 250th anniversary of this nation. Ask yourself this question: where should this nation be on its 250th birthday compared to where it is now? And that defines the work that we have in the United States to do in collaboration with people from all over the world, just as the American Revolution was a collaboration of people all over the world. There could never have been in America without the support from the nations of France, of Russia, Sweden, Poland, Germany for that matter, and many other nations. Spain, very importantly. And without, in specific, let's single out here, the important and unique contribution of the African, then soon to become American, component that was integrated into that revolution, which was not as large as the component that of African slaves that fought against it, but is an important thing to look at in the history of this country. The thing that has been most unfortunate about the foolishness of many of the so-called critical race theory frauds is that they have attempted to seize the American revolutionary tradition from the American people. It's the most important revolutionary tradition in human history. And it's one that we should be proud to not only reestablish, but it's the tradition that, thanks to the efforts of Lyndon LaRouche and his associates, was sort of resurrected about 50 years ago in the form of what's called the American system. We invite everybody to get to know that. We invite everybody to get to know how this whole process was evolved in a surprising way through the auspices of the American Revolution. And that we also invite people, as was said many times, and Helga said it, Harley said it, now I'm going to say it, take a look at that conference of last week. Take the time to watch it, because it's that process of deliberation that we want to request that you become involved in. We entice people to become involved in, because we believe that this is the basis in the short term to bring the United States to where it should be at the time that we reach that 250th anniversary. Clearly, the governments of China, Russia, and other locations of the world would be more than happy if the United States returned to that tradition. But it's up to us to do that. And we can't do that if we think of ourselves as some individual nation separate from all the nations. We're not that. We are part of an international, of an experiment which brought together people from many parts of the world, and was successful. And it will be successful again if that is the outlook we bring to this moment. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank everybody who participated today, and we'll see you here again next week.